Hi folks, welcome. So I'm really stoked to have Chris Magwood here today with us. I remember when I was plotting my way out of my job in downtown Calgary, Chris's first, is it your first book, your strawbale?
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, his book was one of the first ones that I bought on strawbale construction. And I think you designed and built the first off-grid strawbale house, in Canada. And so I kind of had these grandeur dreams of building an off-grid, natural building, and it kind of started me on my journey in a lot of ways. So really excited to have him here in Calgary. What I really love about Chris Magwood's building style, and he actually, this is his words yesterday, but I felt that for a long time, is that he's a non-dogmatic builder in that he will look at whatever's on the table, compare it within his own set of metrics, and then go from there. Chris runs the Endeavour Centre, which is a not-for-profit in Ontario, and I've taught there. It's an incredible space. So if you're looking to get really deep into building methodology and you've got some time to spend with Chris and Jen, they're an incredible resource. Chris's books are amazing. I just did a YouTube review on his latest book, which is Essential Sustainable Home Design. So you can find that on our YouTube channel. And did you bring a copy of it today?
I didn't, no.
Sitting at home. Anyways, highly recommend it. If you're interested in that book, check out our interview on YouTube. I'll just give you a couple quick highlights of the book and what it kind of forms the basis of today. But Chris has done an extensive review of all the different building methodologies. So things like Passive House, Living Building Challenge, R2000, and kind of compared them against each other, up against a bunch of metrics. And he helps you to understand some of the complexity around dealing with building code. I found the book so good that I'm actually going to be implementing a lot of his ideas in my own consulting practice, because it helps me to design high performance properties. I end up doing a lot of work with people on their homes. And so if you're considering building a home or even retrofitting a home, you're going to want to check out this book. It's worth every penny. So thanks, Chris. I'll let you take it away.
Okay, great.
And coffee over there, guys, washrooms. And did you have any other announcements?
Remembrance Day.
Remembrance Day, yeah. And then should we run for about an hour and then take a 15-minute break? Or
But that was
Yeah.
Okay. So 11.
We'll take a break at that point, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we'll do that. So when my alarm goes off, it's shortly after 11, that's
Okay. Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming out. Thanks to Rob and Michelle at Verge for having me here. It's exciting to venture off my own home turf and come see other places and other people. And already in the first half hour, people arriving, some really interesting conversations about things that are going on here. So yeah.
Probably going to be a little bit content heavy, a little bit like me, blah, 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 blah for a really long time. So it stays engaging, and we'll take breaks when I start to see heads, nod, and we'll hopefully, get through it all, and you get, some value out of being here. This course, or the course that this one today is sort of based on, is really our most popular one at Endeavour, and it's been running a long time, and it's also my favorite one to talk about to present because I've been at this for a long time now, but my path very much started as an owner builder, just trying to build a house, and it wasn't intended to turn into the career and everything that it has. But I really, my heart is still with people who have this dream and want to make it happen. And so the ability to sort of share with a lot of people in that place I still really enjoy it. It's really meaningful to me. I'm a bit mixed. Usually at this point, we kind of do a bit of an intro game, but I don't think it's going to work with this many people in the room. But I don't want to plunge in without sort of knowing a little bit about who's in the room and what you're thinking about and what kinds of projects you have percolating in your mind. So if it's okay, I might just actually like quickly go around the room and everybody like just introduce yourself, you know, who you are, where you're from, and why you ended up here and what you're hoping to take away from that. And we'll try to keep it short so it doesn't eat up a chunk of our time. But I feel like it would be weird to start without knowing who I'm talking to. So maybe I'll just start here and pick on you guys. And
let's really kind of focus on the short part, 30 seconds.
yeah.
All started. Writing hobby in the very early stage of thinking about building a 16th home, and I'm here to get some information and broaden my horizons.
Great.
My name's Alexandra. I'm here from Calgary. This is sort of a follow-up to the 2 week chronicles we first did as well.
Okay.
I'm Erin. This is my husband Brian. We're Paxfield. We came in from Kimberley. We just moved away from Calgary in August, and we're trying to build a passive house in Kimberley.
Okay. Let's go back one. Yeah.
I'm Andrew. I have a farm near Winfield, Alberta. I've been working with Coca-Cola on designing the actual landscape and property and
Okay. Great.
I'm Ken from Lethbridge, but I'm looking for land up around Edmonton, Drake Valley area and stuff. And my primary goal is not so much to do body energy, but really on the grid operating, so off grid solar.
Okay. Great.
And also with between separate farm
Great. Nice. Okay. We'll go back again.
I'm debating on doing some little classroom. Yeah, Luca, I actually know Chris from Peterborough.
Peterborough.
Just interested what you have to say and get some ideas.
My name is Luke. I'm from Valley. I'm the farm and other people with home renovations are looking for.
Great. Okay. We'll go to the next table at the back there. Yeah.
I'm Nancy. This is my husband Chad, and we're looking for some ideas for commercial space and.
Jay, we got my house, buy a farm, build another one.
Okay.
I'm Jeremy, Valerie, and been building pastoral greenhouses. So
Yeah. Might as well come forward. Nice.
I'm an architect and I'm starting standards in
My name is Samantha. I am a contractor and I'm interested in physical space for my own company, but also with a nonprofit. I'm starting a conference program as a delivery.
Rob, Calgary. I want to put a second story on our house.
Okay. Up front here.
I'm Ken Crawford. I built the first passive house in Calgary that I'm living in, and I now help design passive houses.
Evan Scott built a single walk-through passive house a couple years ago. So I'm going to expand my knowledge a bit and see if there's a career for me possibly moving forward.
My name's Sean. My wife and I've got a place in West Kootenays, and house is pretty beaten, so somebody who needs to go there, and that's be a good idea.
Okay, we'll come up front here.
Ladies?
I'm Melody. I live here in Calgary. My background is in residential construction, and I'm trying to make the leap to do more sustainable housing. And I have a house involved with small mass and plaster, and I want to retrofit it and other materials and building methods.
My name is Nicole Hartley Bradford. I'm the founder of the Village Virus, and I do want, it's all about connecting people who are interested in saving the world. So I'm here to do that.
Right.
I'm Christina Goodman. I'm supporting Goodman about 35 minutes left. I'm an engineer and here in microscale department, and my plans are these.
My name is Peter Zuurdik. I'm with Go Green Limited. I've been building with hempcrete and with strawbale for the last 15 years. We're trying to set up a sister Endeavour Centre in Alberta, and we're trying to promote hempcrete and strawbale and alternative building methods. And we are attracting AAC manufacturing to Ontario and Alberta.
Next, I'm from Canmore, just looking for some land in Golden and build with natural materials.
My name is Megan. This is my husband. Basically, we were from the city of Alberta. And we have all existing buildings.
Okay, great. And last but not least, the table back there.
I'm Candace. This is Pasha. He's in
Okay, I'll make a lot of direct eye contact right there.
That's all right.
Okay, yeah, got a good section on that coming up. So. Okay. Okay, that's great. Thank you for taking the time to do that. It's really helpful, and I'm really glad that there are homeowners, designers, builders. It's a really good mix in the room. Hopefully, there's something for everybody in here. This is where all of this started for me. This is as Rob said, the first off-grid straw bale, well, the first straw bale of any kind in Ontario, but the first off-grid one too. During the design and construction of which I think I made every possible mistake you can make in approaching a project like that, and yet somehow still, turned out with a home that we loved, raised our daughter in, and really enjoyed, and have since sold and moved on. But it ended up being a wonderful test bed. We were so naive that the whole reason for being off grid was simply we didn't calculate how much it cost to bring the power lines back to this really nice site we had on the property. And when we realized that we couldn't afford it, off-grid was basically our only option. And we lived in the house for 2 years with no electricity, which was really formative for me in understanding more about, well, what is energy and how much energy do I actually need, and what are the difference between needs and wants. And that's been really informative in my sort of practice going forward. And then, building those systems up ourselves slowly, getting a panel and a car battery and sort of moving up from there. By the time we were done, the place had a micro hydro turbine and a small wind tower and some solar. So got to play with lots of things, do it wrong, figure out how to do it right. And sort of out of that experience, because it was so early on, this place was in the middle of nowhere, Ontario, and pre-internet even, people would just show up, like they somehow heard that this had happened. They wanted to know about it. And that kind of led to, well, would you come and help me with mine, or would you come and do a workshop in my town? And the whole thing just kind of slowly turned into a thing. And yeah, I've been really blessed to work on like lots and lots of buildings in the last 25 years. Mostly what we now specialize in at Endeavour is actually small public buildings. We do some residential work, but mostly we concentrate on buildings for not-for-profits. We've done things like a food bank, a thrift store, a museum, an arts center, some outdoor education centers, things like that, where what we're demonstrating, you know, when we do a house, it tends to just be a house, and then it's that person's house, and then they don't want a million people visiting their house all the time. So the small public buildings are really great, and that the educational part keeps going. But as Rob mentioned, I do sort of consider myself a sustainable building omnivore. I'm not, you know, deeply tied to any one material or system. And my interest in all things has sort of led to sort of how this course is set up, which is to really think about how you're going to make all these choices. You know, there are a million good options out there. There's a lot of not so good options, but when it comes to actually weighing these things up, how do you do it? And that's hopefully what I'm going to spend at least the first part of the day on. And I think in general, almost everybody who comes to us looking for design, looking for advice, does so because they're discouraged by what's normal. You know, they're discouraged by looking around and seeing, you know, what they could buy if they bought a new home, or what they, you know, if they're looking at an existing place, like how it's been renovated. There's sort of a general, like, I don't want that, which is a fine place to start. But if you don't want that, then you have to know what you do want. Like, then what is this? And I am not at all, I think the conventional building world actually does a great job. I think there are lots of skilled people doing lots of things really well. The difference, I think, between people who are questioning that and that mainstream building world is simply a matter of the criteria that we're asking of those things. Like, the modern construction industry does a great job of doing what it's been asked to do, which is deliver reasonable cost, reasonable energy efficiency, you know, good timelines, like, you know, the whole thing there, things that people will insure, things that banks want to mortgage. Like, there's a whole set of expectations, and they nail it. They do it really well. If that's not exactly the package you want, then it becomes really important to sort of be able to define, well, what are these other things that you do want. And so, you know, then you get into the realm of custom. It's not really going to be easy for an industry that's set up to kind of go down the middle of the path, appeal to the most number of people in the broadest possible sense, to respond to people who have, you know, particular criteria and a very individual take on it. So, you know, you being able to define what that vision is becomes really important. And there's all kinds of factors, you know. There's people in the room who are going to be driven mainly by cost, some by carbon footprint, some by toxicities. You know, there's so many different aspects to it. And so for our clients, it becomes really important to, like, how do we have that conversation? How do you tell me what you want? Like, how do I know what it is that you're trying to achieve? And so, yeah, how do you tell me what you want, what you really, really want? So what we've sort of worked towards over a lot of projects with a lot of different clients is kind of a set of core criteria. We found that when people do tell us what they want, that it kind of boils down to the same categories. And obviously, you know, different people weight those categories differently, but that there's sort of a, you know, some pretty clear elements to the building and to the project that people want to look at. And so the first part of today is I'm just going to sort of look at how we've categorized those, and then what we think about and try to encourage our clients to think about in each of those criteria. So I think there's 10 different criteria. They're in no particular order. And, you know, in the same way that I'm a sustainable building omnivore, I'm not a particularly judgmental person. If somebody comes to me and says, I don't give a shit about ecosystem impacts, I don't think they're a bad person. They just don't care about ecosystem impacts, but they might really care about energy efficiency or, you know, non-toxicity. And as long as there's, you know, some part of these criteria that people are interested in, then I think it's worth pursuing. So as I'm going through this, you know, hopefully what you're doing is sort of digesting like, oh yeah, like that is meaningful to me, or no, I don't really care about that one. But so this first one, again, no particular order, but thinking about ecosystem impacts, I know that was a big driver for my partner and I when we did our first house, was sort of, you know, looking around at the world and going, oh, we're kind of making a mess of the natural environment. And a lot of that has to do with how we're getting building materials. Like, you know, forests are being hacked down, mines are being dug, you know, there's all this background sort of impact from these buildings. And so this is kind of like the first level of thinking that we go through when we start looking at a project where somebody does care about ecosystem impacts, is, you know, sort of looking at, well, what resources are we talking about? Are they renewable or non-renewable? If they're non-renewable, are they abundant but non-renewable, or are they scarce? Looking at, you know, when you go and harvest this material, what happens? Like, just informing yourself a little bit about the process. When I want to make hempcrete, it's helpful to know, like, what goes on at a hemp farm, like what's happening to the land, what are the imports, what are the you know, the results of that. So are waterways being diverted or interrupted, biodiversity being compromised, what are the effluents and discharges, what are the pollutions, what are the inputs, sort of getting a sense of that particular material and what is involved, what types of pollutions are associated in the manufacturing, you know, how clean is the process, and not just the process, but the actual place I'm going to get it from. You know, there's ways to make drywall that are pretty clean, and there's ways to make drywall that are really dirty. And so what's going on, you know, at this CGC factory versus, you know, this other factory over here, that's something we look at too. How's water being used? And are these companies doing anything in the way of mediation, you know, once they've harvested or manufactured? Are they doing anything to try to right those things? And kind of the illustration there is of, you know, two things that I would say are at the opposite end of that spectrum. You know, if I think about the ecosystems of a factory that makes foam insulation products, I'm thinking, okay, that starts with oil exploration, goes through taking oil out of the ground, wherever that happens, pipelining it, you know, all the processing that goes on at the factory. And I think about, okay, there are a range of, you know, fairly severe ecosystem impacts that are associated with that. Or I look at what Ecovative in New York State's doing, making this mycofoam stuff, and they grow some spores, they chop up some straw, they put the spores in the straw, they add some flour and water, and it grows. And then they heat it up to 100 degrees and it stops growing, and there's basically no ecosystem impacts from that. So, you know, if somebody comes to me and says, well, this is really important to me, I'm probably going to steer them in the direction of those sorts of options, and you know, suggest that they stay away from the high impact things like foam. And feel free to interrupt with questions at any point too. So don't feel like you just have to sit and listen. So the second criteria that we'll look at is the embodied carbon, and this is now kind of like my personal central driving reason for doing what I do, and what I think about probably more than anything else. So I have a personal connection to this one, and that is, you know, looking at what is the climate change impact of the choices I'm going to make. And, you know, I think I'm taking the warnings from the IPCC pretty seriously, that there's not a lot of time to do something about this. And so this is really key for me. So again, it's the same types of questions. What kind of carbon emissions are associated with that harvesting? So on the last one, we're looking at actual impacts to the ecosystem, to the water, to the air, to the land. Here, it's like specifically how much carbon is coming out while this stuff is being harvested, being manufactured, and being transported around. Also, is there any atmospheric carbon being stored or sequestered in the material that I'm considering? And importantly for this one, where am I getting this data from? How am I figuring that out? And just to show you really quickly, because I'm actually doing my master's degree in this right now, so I'm making all these really cool charts. So I'm really excited about them. This is a model that I made of a small 1,000 square foot sort of sample home, built in Ontario, heated with an air source heat pump. And what I'm looking at is the orange bar here is the carbon emissions that happen when these materials are made and processed. And this house is like just nothing special, code compliant in terms of its energy efficiency, pretty typical materials, stud framing, fiberglass insulation, a layer of foam on the outside, asphalt shingle roof, like kind of what you'd see everywhere and anywhere. And before you walk into the door of that house, it's responsible for about 21 tons of CO2 emissions. So before you've turned on the furnace or flicked on a light switch, that's kind of the footprint of that house. And that's a small house too. When you multiply that out, like those are big numbers. And you can see with a heat pump, the operational emissions, that red bar actually doesn't add that much. Our grid's pretty clean in Ontario. It's a pretty efficient way to make heat. So, for this building, I could spend a lot of time and money trying to make it more energy efficient, which will drop this little red bar a little bit. And by the way, you probably can't see the numbers, but this is scaled out from 2018 to 2050. Thinking about, past 2050, we'll either have figured the climate change thing out or not, but, things might get squirrely after this, so I didn't go much further. But, I could look at this house and I could go, well, let's make this way more energy efficient and drop our emissions, by which I will be dropping this little red bar. So that's what I did on this house. So this, I sort of took to close to passive house levels, and I did it all with spray foam. Look what happens. My embodied carbon emissions are now 90 tons from making that house. This code-built, energy not efficient house, its embodied emissions and its operational emissions by 2050 are like less than half of what this high performance house has put into the atmosphere before anybody's even moved in. So if you're thinking seriously about climate change and you don't want your building to be a big driver of climate change, you want to avoid that kind of scenario where you can't, the theory has long been, well, if you make it really energy efficient, there's sort of like a carbon payback or an energy payback. There's no payback here. Yes, you've significantly, that little red stripe is now very, very small, but it's not that much smaller than this one, but the orange stripe is huge, and that's problematic for the climate. Excitingly, down here is the kind of buildings that we often do where we're using a lot of carbon storing materials. And carbon storing materials are plants. They're really, everybody's on the hunt for the big carbon capture and storage machine that's going to suck all this CO2 out of the air and put it into a great form that we can either bury or use or something like that. Well, plants do that. That's what plants already do. About half the weight of any plant material, whether it's a stick of hemp or a straw or a tree, is about half its weight is carbon that came out of the atmosphere. And so, and you can use a bunch of those materials in the building. What happens is now what used to be an orange line is a green line. There's actually more carbon in the building, net carbon in the building, than was emitted in making the rest of the materials. So you can start as a carbon capture and storage building, as a machine that's captured a bunch of carbon. And then this same energy efficient little line, you can barely notice it, it's at the bottom eating away at that. But it takes till about 2150 before the operational energy has, come up to the point where this is no longer a carbon storing building. So for a good long chunk of time, you can make a building that actually is a climate change reverser instead of a climate change maker.
Yeah, so your middle example is what Mike Holmes and modern houses and that old house.
This is where everybody's going. This
Yeah,
is our sort of typical Western narrow thinking, like energy efficiency is like the thing to do. That's everything. That's green building. That's carbon emissions.
Just to save that little bit on top,
Yeah,
all that stuff in the bottom is happening, and
Yeah.
people just don't realize.
yeah. It was shocking to me. I mean, the whole reason I'm so involved in this study is because I just decided to add up some numbers, and I looked at them and was like, wow, these are big numbers. So that's another criteria that we look at. Yep,
The only difference between the second and third are material choice.
that's right.
Our value is the same.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's just don't use spray foam, which not many people use expensive anyway.
Right. Or, well, I mean, spray foam, XPS is almost as bad. EPS is less bad, but still like pretty high on the positive side.
Yeah.
Fiberglass puts you in the positive side. Mineral wool puts you in the.
Long cellulose, CLT, wood fiberboard, which is what the high performance buildings
Yeah.
are doing.
Yeah. And so like, it's straight material substitution it makes the difference between that and that. Yeah. So energy efficiency, this shows up on most people's radar. And when we're talking to clients about energy efficiency, this is an easy one to kind of have a discussion about because it's really easy to make targets. You know, there's already a national building code sort of like standard, and you can beat it by, you can match it, you can beat it by 25%, 50%, 90%, whatever you want. It's sort of easy to choose a number and aim for that. But along with figuring out how energy efficient, and this kind of ties to the embodied carbon one, also looking at, you know, what kind of fuel source are you going to be using to meet those power needs? What does your grid look like? You know, I think the results from those graphs I showed you would be very different here in Alberta because a heat pump being powered by coal-fired power plants isn't as carbon clean as a heat pump, you know, being generated by Niagara Falls or a nuclear plant in Ontario, which is relatively carbon-free. So, what kind of grid do you have, and what are you going to be attaching to? How efficient are those fuels? Looking at equipment and that kind of efficiency too. So it's one thing to go, oh, I'm going to get an air source heat pump, but then you sort of have to go down into, well, which ones and why and how efficient are they? Service life and performance degradation of the choices you make to support energy efficiency, maintenance and use of the system. And in particular, I think this one is extremely important now that we're trying to be more energy efficient, is who's in charge of quality control during construction. Like, it's one thing to design an awesome energy efficient house, but it is so easy for that to not ever meet those design targets if people are drilling holes through an air barrier, or, you know, there's just so many places that it can sort of go sideways. And so you think you aimed high here, but due to sort of quality control, it didn't turn out that way. And do your actual lifestyle choices support the level of energy efficiency you're talking about? You know, it's one thing to be super, you know, have your home be super energy efficient, but if you run 3 flat screen TVs 24 hours a day and, you know, have a crappy old fridge, you know, yeah, you know, and the more energy efficient you make the house, the more of an impact all those other loads have on it. So, I mean, we use a pretty common tool to do that. So we model all our buildings in the Passive House software. We don't typically certify very many buildings to Passive House standard, but it's a really good software package. And then the consultants we work with, they typically will make us and our clients a little graph like this. Don't worry about actually reading it or seeing the numbers, but they basically, you know, take the base house and then play with some of the parameters that make windows bigger, make windows smaller, improve the quality of windows, reduce the quality of windows, shift the orientation of the building around. They'll sort of play with things. So, you know, our starting point here is saying, like, a code-built house to this design would need 56 kilowatt hours per meter squared. And if we're aiming for Passive House, that's 15. So we need to find 41 kilowatt hours per meter squared of savings. And so they kind of go through and they look at different options and they say no to some and yes to some. And then they kind of give us like, here are some things you could do, and here's where we ended up with our energy numbers for that. And that's an extremely valuable methodology for making sure that you're actually going to meet the energy efficiency targets you want. And it's a really good tool for also understanding the cost implications. Some of these things you could go, well, yeah, sure, I reduce my energy footprint by 30%, but it's going to cost me $20,000 to do it. Whereas other things like adding another 8 inches of cellulose in the attic, which might cost you $300 in materials, is going to save you 10% on that energy bill. So those are the kind of decisions that sort of feed into this process. So this is a fairly iterative process. Like we'll go through this, 2, often 3 times. So, have a design, run it through this, make some decisions, make some changes, see how the next version spits out, revise it again, make some changes, see how the next version spits out, and eventually we'll end up, with a very realistic energy target.
So does it also show you then that advantage again, where you said the carbon walking capability of plant material? In this, you could.
So this particular spreadsheet doesn't, it's material neutral. It's just saying, if you use R value, this will be the result. And then if somebody's interested in carbon, we would then take that and figure out what material to use to get that. So indoor environment quality is another really key aspect in our practice. We take it really seriously, and we try to make every building we do completely non-toxic, like no chemicals of question in the building at all. And that's shockingly hard to do. So we'll look at some of those chemicals, but in general, we're thinking about air, water, and light, and for all of them, thinking about like what are the kinds of those substances we want in the building, like what sort of quality do we want, and how are we going to get it? How is it mechanically regulated? Is it just windows? Where are we getting our water? Are we filtering that water somehow? So all of those kinds of things, getting the client to think about like what kind of standards would they like to get to. At a bare minimum, we try to look at the Living Building Challenges chemical red list and exclude any materials that we find contain things on this list. And to date, it has been impossible for us to do that. So, and the red list is interesting because, there are lots of chemicals in building materials where the science is not like 100% that this is actually, going to hurt you. These are the ones that science is there. Like these are like unmistakably, undeniably, really, really bad for people. And we can't even make a building that excludes these. So when you get into the more questionable ones, it gets harder. And the tough ones to avoid are things like PVC and formaldehyde. Tend to be the ones that really choke that process. You can get rid of most PVC, but if you're going to have electrical wires in your building, they're wrapped in vinyl, and so there's not much you can do about that. Some plumbing parts, things like that, but you can eliminate it to a pretty high degree. The other ones that are really hard to get away from are these ones, the flame retardants, the halogenated flame retardants. Those are in really high quantities in any foam building materials. And if you're not off foam because of the carbon reasons, you should read the Green Science Foundation's. There's a thing called the San Antonio Statement, I think it's called, where about 300 of the world's best health scientists got together to ask the world to stop making those chemicals because they are so dangerous and so persistent. One of the things that spurred it was they did a breast milk study of women around the world. They did not find a single woman anywhere on the planet who did not have that in their breast milk. It's extremely persistent, and depending on the foam you're using, somewhere between 5 and 25% of the weight of the foam you're using are those flame retardants. So that's one that I think is if you're concerned about this at all, one that you should be thinking about.
How does radon fit in here?
Radon's not on this red list. Radon would be something, again, that we would look at when we're looking at, in the air quality of the building. And it's, for me, that's not even a question. We do radon remediation right from the get-go, even if it's not in an area where you'd expect to find it. So,
Right in the design.
yeah, an exhaust pipe, under the foundation of the building being vented to the outside. Yeah. So another thing that we'll do if somebody wants us to go a little bit further than the red list is just start looking material by material at what's in these things. So I'm picking on this one. This is drywall compound. I'm choosing it because pretty much every house uses it. And they're not all created equal. Not all of them look like this, but here's one from USG. It's a pretty common one. You find it on the shelf of every big box store. It's got 3 ingredients of its 4 ingredients that are either known carcinogens or mutagens. And it doesn't tell you that in their MSDS sheet. You have to go to the MSDS sheet for those actual substances, and it'll tell you that this isn't good for people. And what do we do with this particular one? We sand it into really fine particulate inside the house, hope that we clean it up afterwards, but we don't, and all that stuff ends up inside people. So, if a client really wants, a truly non-toxic home, we kind of go down to that level of making sure that all the products that we're choosing work. Then the good thing that's happened over the last 20 years is there's a clean replacement for everything. I have found that, I no longer have to just shrug and go, oh, well, we need to mud these joints, and that's what drywall compound has in it. There are clean versions of everything, but you'll rarely find them in a big box store, and it's going to add some time and complexity and sometimes cost to your project to go and track them down and get them. Yep. Yeah, we do like a fair bit of sort of like product stuff on our website at Endeavour. And our new website, which will be out in the new year, we're actually going to do sort of like a product guide for that reason to kind of like, yeah.
What is the website?
EndeavourCentre.org. Waste is a really interesting one to think about. You don't really think about necessarily the building decisions you make up front at the design phase having a big impact on waste, but it really does. So the average 2,000 square foot house in Ontario, it's probably the same here, puts out about 8,000 pounds of solid waste to landfill. So that's a lot, when you multiply that out by the number of homes that get built. The home we did last year put out 18 pounds of landfill waste. And those are choices that you make up front. You think about, what is this material? It's going to seem like I'm picking on drywall. I'm not trying to, it just comes to mind right off the top. But like, as soon as you make a choice to do drywall, you are going to have a whole bunch of offcuts that aren't going anywhere, probably except landfill. I know there's a couple here. Okay, because in Ontario, we still can't. You can, yeah. But those are the kinds of things to know. It's like, is there a drywall recycling program? If it is, then drywall is an appropriate choice for a low waste building. If there's not, there isn't. We had that. We used a material called Rewall as a drywall replacement. It's compressed juice box board. It was a great product, fully recyclable, except that none of our recyclers would take it because they want their box board in a form where they can crush it into bales. And when we were giving them dense slabs of this board, they were like, no, we're not taking that. So there was an issue where, looking into that is really important to sort of know what you are the things you're choosing. Can they be composted? Can they be recycled? What happens to these things, and in what quantities are those wastes generated? So sheet materials, board materials tend to generate a lot of waste because they come in 4x8s, and you only put up a handful of full sheets, and then they all have window cutouts and door cutouts and electrical box cutouts and all the the angles and all that kind of stuff. So really thinking about that, and also if you're sort of going back to your ecosystem's impacts, thinking about what does it mean when that material goes away? Like, is that something that's going to leach bad chemicals into the ground, or something like that? So another sort of whole thing to explore. Resilience has started to come up. I don't think we had anybody use the word 5 years ago, and now lots of clients are fairly concerned about this. And I think all the news reports about climate change and what's happening, and floods and fires and winds and all that kind of stuff is starting to bring this up. So our sort of the sort of key thing for us is trying to get a sense from people of what degree of resilience, if it's important to you at all, are you interested in? Like, are you interested in getting through the 3-day storm? Are you interested in getting through a month-long disruption? Or are you bunkering down and you want to make it through the next 10 years of the Armageddon or something like that? So, and obviously the response from a designer's point of view is vastly different for those scenarios. This really kind of changes a lot of approaches to design if somebody is looking for a high degree of resilience.
How about forest fires?
Yeah, that one too. If you're in a place where that happens, that's
Oh, we had heat towns burn down here.
Yeah.
Over.
Yeah. And obviously this was not on the radar for the designers of those buildings. So it should be if you're in a place where that's going to happen. Another really important part to resilience, I think, is thinking about not just does the building function or stay standing through something, but if you make a good fire resistant building and the fire sweeps through and your house didn't burn down, that's great. But are you able to repair or replace the things that did get damaged? Are the systems that are now down, because that happened, systems that you can fix again? Do the parts come from down the street, or do they come from Germany? If you're thinking about disruptions, you have to think about not just the immediate survival, but the sort of ongoing viability of being able to keep that building functional. So that's another whole area that we think about. And if you want help on this, there's a website called resilientdesign.org. This is their sort of 10 resilient design principles, but their website's got a lot of great information about how you would sort of get a little bit deeper into this. By the way, I'm going to make these slides available, so don't feel like you have to scribble everything down that you're seeing. And then some of those charts you'll actually be able to read as well and stuff. So
Do you want to do a break in about 8 minutes?
yeah, I have 2 more criteria and then we'll, yeah. So maintenance and durability is another one that we think about a lot. And it's kind of got those 2 elements to it. So maintenance is how much input does the person residing in the building or who operates the building, how much are they wanting to or expecting to have input into the building? And it's amazing how much that changes the design approach. If you have somebody that's willing to do something as small as open or close a valve, or turn on or off an air duct or something like that once or twice a year, the cost and complexity and often energy efficiency of that building can go way up for very little money. But if the person's not going to do that, then it's not going to work. And so, knowing is this somebody who's going to sort of reliably put in the time and effort it takes. A good example of this is just having a wood stove. There's a lot of good reasons to have wood be your fuel, but you got to make and feed that fire every day, through the winter. And that's a commitment that some people are happy to make. And it's a commitment that some people, we've unfortunately done 2 buildings where we put in beautiful masonry heaters that are now beautiful empty centerpieces in the middle of the home, because the people using them just didn't have it in their lifestyle, in their whatever, to just make sure that thing was hot and kept going, and they ended up putting in secondary forms of heat because that just didn't work for them. And that, you know, thinking about that from the beginning would sort of help avoid those things. And then on the durability side, I think there's the sort of our normal notion of durability, which is like, how long before I have to replace this is one way of looking at it. And another way of looking at it is this maintainable? So a lot of things that we put into homes as sort of maintenance free actually means maintenance free until it fails and it's garbage and you can't actually do anything with it and you have to replace it. Whereas things that need maintenance, but can often go on forever. And this is my example of that is vinyl siding, which is, you know, the sort of go-to low maintenance option. And it is low maintenance until it cracks or breaks or warps or just sort of hits the end of its lifespan, and you can't fix it. Like you can't get a plastic welder and, you know, put all those pieces back together and then put a new coat of paint on it and move on. It's garbage. Or an earthen plaster, which, you know, would seem to be a bad choice in terms of maintenance, but and that bottom picture is at my mom's house. That's the first earthen plaster building we did. And after 15 years, we had this little corner that needed repair. To repair it, I took some of the same dirt that we used to make the building, mushed it up, rubbed it on the wall, and now it's good for another 15 years. And we can do that for the next 200 years, 300 years. Like that's, so again, that's not for everybody, but thinking about, you know, what is your approach to maintenance? Are you thinking about, you know, short-term products that are going to last and then be replaced, or things that can go for a long time? Costs, this is much lower on the list than it usually is on most people's lists. This is usually top of list. And it's, you know, I have yet to work for the client who came and told me cost is no consideration. So it's, you know, it is a consideration, and it's usually an extremely serious one. So questions that we have for people right off the bat is, you know, are you actually thinking about a size of building, and I think a complexity of building that is in line with your budget? And quite often the answer to that is no, you know. You know, being able to sort of make those expectations, thinking about wants versus needs, and how you might be able to pare things down is really important. This next one kind of took me by surprise, but it's happened a lot. And so I think it's worth mentioning. We get a lot of people who come to us who have based their budget figures and kind of like their design, their early design ideas on kind of like a back of the envelope sketch of what the big ticket items for that building are going to cost. Like, you know, they've added up the cost of solar panels and of straw bales and of like metal roofing and like a bunch of those big ticket items. And then they're like, okay, so, you know, here's our budget and we can do it for this. And that is so far from the case that, you know, people get really shocked when they see. So whole cost budget accounting is really important. And then all kinds of other things about, you know, quality and performance, like things that are cheaper usually don't last as long. So are you like investing early for longer performance or not? Are you investing your money in good labor practices? Like if that's important to you, it might matter that your whatever roofing was made in a local union factory than, you know, a sweatshop in Asia or something like that. So, you know, are you targeting your money where you want to? Are you thinking about material costs and labor costs as having a balance? Quite often, the things that are the cheapest in terms of their material costs end up having the most labor associated with them, and kind of vice versa. Balancing all of that, and then thinking a lot about the carrying costs. You know, that probably the single biggest ticket item by the time you've paid off your house has been interest on your mortgage. It isn't which heating system you had or what insulation you went with. It's interest. And so, you know, figuring out how do you address that? How do you sort of try to save on that? One way is by building a less expensive house. Another way is by building a house with a budget that you know you can like pay down that mortgage faster. You know, but I think that's something that rarely gets looked at. But You know, it'll be close to a third of what you totally spend on your house will be that. And so keeping track of that. This is just something I show people about the whole systems accounting. You know, if you look at a PV system, most people add up the cost of the panels. So here's a 10 kilowatt system. And when I looked at this one, it was about $9,200 for the panels. So somebody's like, great, I need about 10 grand for solar. And then you add the roof mounts, the inverters, all the gear and equipment, optimizers, wire, junction boxes, and that's another 8,200. So you only had half the picture when you thought about, you know, the cost of solar panels for your house. And so, you know, kind of avoiding getting stuck in that trap is helpful. Labor looks a lot like the cost, the material cost one. You know, just thinking about who's doing this labor, what's required of them. Does the expertise exist locally? I know, especially in the energy efficiency world, there is so much cool equipment in Europe, and it's so tempting to bring that over and use it because it's like 86% more efficient than what we can get here. But who puts it in? You know, who maintains it when it breaks down? And it's not a reason to not get it, but it's a reason to think about that seriously and sort of, you know, go in with those expectations. If you're going to do a bunch of the work yourself, how much of the work are you going to do? Are you capable of doing it? So yeah, contracts, be great to do a weekend workshop for owner builders on how to write a reasonable contract, because it's amazing in residential construction in particular. It's rare that there's any contracts involved at all. It tends to be phone calls. Hey, electrician. Okay, yeah, you're going to come here. You're going to do this. Okay, great. You're going to do it for that much. Super, great. Thanks. No. Like scope of work documents, and don't feel like a jerk for doing it. It's really important. Scope of work documents. You know, what happens when it goes over? Where does somebody's job start and somebody else's job end? Like that stuff gets so important. How are deficiencies going to be managed? All of that stuff is just really key. And like, even if it's your buddy, even if it's your best friend, write a contract. It's really easy. It doesn't have to be full of, you know, legalese. It can just be like this is how we talk, and we're going to put that on paper, and we're going to sort of make it clear, and we're both going to sign it. But I would like the vast majority of the sort of headaches and heartaches that I see owner builders go through would be solved by having actual contracts with the people who work on the buildings. So can't stress that one more than enough. And the last one we'll look at is code compliance. And later on, I'll do a sort of like deeper dive into alternative compliance materials and stuff like that. But for now, the thing to know is that the building code in Canada is like a 2-pathway code. So there is the prescriptions. So that's the actual stuff that you'll find in the building code that says, like, do this, do this, do this, do this, has all those rules. And those are called accepted solutions. So that's, you know, what is already in the code. And then there's a whole other objective pathway for alternative solutions. And if what you're doing isn't recognized in the accepted side, then you're going to be going down the alternative solution side. And I'll sort of show you what that process looks like later. But it's good to know early on, like, how much are you wanting to or willing to veer into this? You know? If the answer is not at all, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to have to compromise any of your other goals. You know, if you want to build a healthy, low carbon, energy efficient, non-toxic house, you can do it with completely accepted solution materials, or you can do a straw bale, earth plastered, you know, whatever, and like you're all into alternative compliance. And one is not better or worse than the other. It's just sort of like, what are you prepared to deal with? You know, do you want this to breeze through the code thing, or are you willing to, you know, push for the things that you want to see? And knowing what else is around in your region that has already done an alternative solution like that is really helpful. So kind of getting into the network of who's already done this, and sort of like knowing that A, you can point to that example, and B, you could probably go talk to that person and find out like what were the hoops that you had to jump through to do that. And also in this is like, think about who's going to help you with this. Like, is this you talking to the building department? Is it an architect? Is it an engineer? Is it a code consultant? You know, it's definitely its own little world, and you know, you sort of want to know how much of that you want to bite off and chew on. And the very last criteria, and this one is, this doesn't have, there's no way to rate this or talk about it or put it on a graph or anything like that, but it is, I mean, for most people, like, the aesthetics of this thing you're going to build are super important. And not that what your goals would limit your aesthetics, but sometimes they don't cross. Like, you know, if you love the look of stone, but want to do a straw bale house, like, those two things are harder to put together than, you know, a frame wall in stone, or, you know what I mean? Like, just how does the sort of overall aesthetics, you bought a beautiful piece of property, it slopes down to the lake and it faces north, and you want to have beautiful views to the north. Like, it's not to say don't have those beautiful views, but you might have to change your energy efficiency expectations if you want to have, you know, 50 feet of glazing facing the north side of the building. So those are sort of extreme examples, but sort of like, yeah, just always making sure that the choices you're making aren't sort of overlapping or getting in the way of this. So yeah, we'll take a little break here, and then we'll sort of look, next we'll look at how different rating systems can kind of help you filter through some of that information. 10 minutes? Okay.